Hello and welcome to our final video in this series on principal component analysis. I hope you have gone through and enjoyed the previous videos in this series. If not, I would highly recommend you to at least go through the videos on linear transformation, change of basis matrix, and covariance matrix as transformation matrix, because these concepts underlie what we are going to discuss regarding the principal component analysis. Now, principal component analysis is one of the most useful data analysis techniques. It helps us identifying patterns in highly complex data sets, and it can tell us which dimensions in our data set are most important. This is very useful in the case of huge amount of data with lot of dimensions, which is usually the case in most of the real life data sets. If you want to work with all the dimensions in a data set, that becomes computationally very intensive. PCA helps you in understanding which dimensions are important. That means which dimensions contain most of the data that the dataset is trying to represent. If you have gone through the previous videos, you remember this example where we have captured from a student dataset the weight on the x-axis and the age on the y-axis. We said that since students belonging to a specific class usually don't vary much in age, we see that in the age dimension the variance is pretty less. However, we see a very high variance in the weight dimension. So in this case, the weight dimension, which has the highest variability, also is the dimension which carries most of the information. And therefore, even if I ignore the age dimension completely and only capture the weight related details of the students from this data set, I wouldn't still lose much of the information from this data set. In other words, what I'm trying to do here is, by considering only the dimension which has most of the information and ignoring the other dimension which doesn't have much information, I'm reducing the dimensionality of this data set from a two-dimensional data set to a single dimensional data set. However, when you consider dimensionality reduction, the final dimensions that we come up with need not always be the original dimensions. For example, in this case where we are capturing the weight and height of the students, we see that most of the variation is in this direction. Now as we can see, this direction can be a linear combination of weight and height dimensions, and it is capturing most of the information that is present in the data set. So for dimensionality reduction, we can figure out this particular dimension and then project all the points from this data set onto this dimension, and therefore convert this data set from a two-dimensional data set to a single dimensional data set. The final dimension that we come up with need not always have a meaning or a name. It is just the direction which has the highest variance. Similarly, if you have the student data set with say 5 different dimensions here, you can probably figure out certain dimensions which are linear combinations of these two and probably call it BMI, body mass index, which captures information present in both weight and height, and a second linearly independent dimension called say analytical ability, which captures the information present in the score in math, logic, and data analysis, and therefore reduce the dimensionality of this data set from 5 to 2. Now, if you have a million rows in this data set, by reducing this dimensionality, you are reducing the total number of data points that you are working with from 5 million to 2 million, which is a huge reduction and reduces the computational requirements by a huge margin. Now, how does PCA help in dimensionality reduction? This is where all the concepts that we have discussed in the prior videos come into picture. We'll not go into the actual calculation part on how PCA is performed, but rather what we'll try to understand here are the steps that are involved in performing PCA and why these steps are performed. This is where all the concepts that I have discussed earlier come into picture on using covariance matrix as a transformation matrix, using eigenvectors as the basis vectors, changing the basis from standard coordinate system to eigenvectors as the basis. Now, let us take this three-dimensional data set as an example, where we are capturing the weight in the x-axis, the height in the y-axis, and age in the z-axis. Now, for all the students in a specific class, again like we discussed earlier, the age wouldn't change much. So you would see that there is very less variance in the z direction. All the variance mostly lies in the weight and height dimensions, which is x and y dimensions. Now the first step in performing PCA is to calculate covariance matrix. Why covariance matrix? Like we discussed in our last video, covariance matrix when used as a transformation matrix helps us in identifying the directions which have the highest variance or the directions which have the highest amount of information in a particular data set. So this is the covariance matrix for this data set. Now the second step is to calculate the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of this covariance matrix. Why? Like we discussed in our previous video, eigenvectors provide us the direction which contains the highest variance, and eigenvalues provide us the corresponding amount of variance in those particular direction. Calculating the eigenvectors for this particular data set, we see there are three eigenvectors which get generated for this data set. Like we spoke about earlier, any scaling factor applied on these eigenvectors to create new vectors also become eigenvectors. But as you would expect, in a three-dimensional data set, you would have at least three different eigenvectors. And as you can see here, we saw that this is the direction which contains the highest amount of variance, and therefore you will see an eigenvector pointing in that direction. What are the corresponding eigenvalues? Lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3 represent the corresponding eigenvalues. And as you would expect, lambda 1 has the highest amount of eigenvalue because that is the direction in which you would see the most amount of variance in the particular data set. And how much of variance is being explained by each eigenvector? We can figure that out by dividing each eigenvalue by the sum of all the eigenvalues. And it gives you that the first eigenvector, which is in green here, it is explaining 95.3% of the total variance. The second eigenvector is explaining 3.7% of the total variance. And the third eigenvector is explaining only 1% of the total variance. Intuitively, this makes sense because most of the variance is in this direction with a small amount of variance in this direction and very little variance towards the z dimension. That is what these numbers are representing. These eigenvectors or those vectors which represent the direction of which contains the highest amount of information are called as principal components. And this entire process is called principal component analysis because we are trying to figure out what the principal components of this data set are and figure out how much variation is in the direction of each principal component. So we have completed the third step as well. Identify the principal components which explain the most of the variance. Now the fourth step is reducing the dimensionality. How do you decide which dimensions to consider and which dimensions to ignore? Again, that is dependent on the amount of variance that are being explained by these dimensions. You can see that the two principal components, the green and the orange one, explain 99% of the total information in this data set. 95.3 plus 3.7. That explains 95% of total information that is present in this data set. The third principal component, the yellow one, it is explaining only 1% of the total variance in this data set or 1% of total information in this data set. Now, if you want to reduce the dimensions, then it is ideal for us to ignore the third dimension represented by this third eigenvector and then consider only those two dimensions which capture 99% of the information that is present in this data set. Note that these data points are still in the original coordinate system represented by these three dimensions: weight, height, and age. Now, in order to reduce the dimensionality, we have chosen that these two dimensions are the ones which contain most of the information. So the only remaining step is for us to change the coordinate system to be represented by these two dimensions as the basis vectors and then project these data points onto these two dimensions and figure out what the coordinates of these data points and these new dimensions are. That is what this fifth and sixth point talk about. We basically use the change of basis matrix, which we talked about in one of our previous videos, in order to convert these coordinates from the original coordinate system into a new coordinate system defined by these two eigenvectors as the basis vectors and project these particular points onto the new coordinate system so that we have a new system altogether defined by only these two dimensions which captures 99% of the original information. This is how the PCA helps you in reducing the dimensionality of a data set. Just think of these dimensions as the new angles from which you are looking at this data. so that you have the most of the information from this data visible, and you change your entire frame of reference to this new coordinate system so that you have much lesser data to work with while retaining most of the information from the original data set. As I said earlier, most of our real life data sets are multidimensional data sets with hundreds and thousands of dimensions. Applying PCA on those data sets in order to figure out which dimensions are actually important, that is, which dimensions capture most of the data, and change your entire frame of reference into those particular dimensions. So in this series, we have talked about a lot of linear algebra concepts and then talked about PCA while applying these concepts to understand how PCA helps while analyzing a particular data set and makes our life much easier. If you have any questions on any part of this series, feel free to put them in the comments below. Thank you so much.